All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. For this conversation, I'm really psyched. I have a guest I've been trying to get on here for a while, and he's got a lot of history with a lot of classic New Jersey bands, including one that we share, actually. So we have a lot of things to dive into. It's really a great pleasure to finally have on Andy Skovran. Andy, man, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Joel.
Absolutely, man. It's like I said, I've been wanting to do this since the beginning. So
I think we first talked like in last summer or something, and we just never got together and connected.
yeah, I mean, life is like that, obviously. The older we get, the more shit we got to plow through, and before you know it, it's like 2 years after the fact. So,
Yeah,
but it only took us a few months, so we're ahead of the game. But for the viewer who's new to Andy, Andy's been a member of the New Jersey punk scene for decades now, going back to the early 80s. Still very active playing music. Has put out a ton of great records, some of which are absolute classics in the history of New Jersey. So we got a lot of things, a lot of things to sort of get through here. But take me back to the very beginning. Are you a New Jersey native?
yes and no. Originally born in New York City, Lower East Side, right on Canal Street. Lived on in a railroad apartment, windows in the front, windows in the back, bathtub in the middle of the kitchen that also served as a counter. But I moved to Jersey in let's see, '67 when I was like 5 years old to Fairlawn.
Oh, okay, okay. So you pretty much grew up there, spent your teen
That
years
was
in
yes.
Jersey. Excellent. And when and how did music sort of take shape for you and end up being such an important part of your life moving forward?
Well, I've always loved music. I came from a house that had always had music, whether it was Elvis or WABC radio at the time, which played music. Everything from that to Frankie Valli. My mom, Elvis. My mom was very much into music, and she'd always be walking around the house singing, all the songs that were on the radio. So I always took a very big interest in music early on, and luckily I started getting into music before there was punk rock. So I got to really soak in some band, from the Rolling Stones to Who. The Doors, those are bands I love. Grateful Dead. I saw the Grateful Dead a bunch of times.
Absolutely. When was your first introduction to punk?
Listening to the Sex Pistols and Clash. The very first punk gig I ever went to, 1981. I saw the Clash at Bonds twice. So
Wow.
that was my first, and that sort of just lit a fire underneath me.
Well, I mean, being in Fairlawn at that period of time, it wasn't necessarily, I would imagine, a hotbed of information about what was coming up musically. How were you first sort of made aware of these things happening in the greater scene?
News, and there was some video show that used to be on Friday nights at like 1 or 2 in the morning that I used to watch. I got introduced to Stiff Little Fingers there. The Selector, for the specials, into ska bands, and also I'd actually see a band, be like write their name down, go to the record store, try to find a record.
What record stores were around back
I
then?
you know, I can't even think of boy, Grandway, a department store. I bought a couple of records there even, but I didn't find like independent record shops till about a year later. Sound Exchange on Route 23 being one of them, which has been there for like I don't know if it's the same people owning it, but it's been there well over 40 plus years now.
Oh yeah, yeah. That actually started out, I believe, owned by the guys from that band Dramarama from Wayne.
Yes, 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 that's right.
And I believe it was called Looney Tunes, but I think it may have been somebody who's going to come up in this conversation in a little bit, Dave Scott, who told me he went to see a Plasmatics in store there in the
Oh
early
wow.
80s. So yeah, that place has always been, that's where I got all my records. My uncle lived across the street behind like where the old Bachagaloop's pizza place used to be. So,
Okay.
when I was a kid, I mean a kid, I would go to the sound exchange and just get records I thought the cover looked cool with, or the band's name struck me, and that's how I found. I got my copy of Nevermind the Bollocks there when I was fifth grade, maybe something like that. So yeah, that place is definitely a cornerstone for a lot of people who grew up in our area, kind of learning about this stuff. So we saw the Clash. Were you playing bass at that point? Had you
No,
started doing that?
absolutely nothing. No playing bass. If you want to tell me to tell now how I got into playing music, I met Harpo finally. Harpo lived in Fairlawn also. He grew up in Fairlawn. He was still in high school when I met him. I met him in Long Island at a show in Long Island. And we started hanging out slowly. And he was like, "Oh, come see my band play. We're practicing on Sunday." And the studio was literally like I was still at my parents' house then, so it was like 3 blocks away. Second City Studios in Elmwood Park, and I went down to see him, and their bass player didn't show up. So Harper was like, "Okay, you're singing from now on. I'm playing bass, and we're playing in Akron, Ohio, in 2 weeks." I was like, "Okay." So we went to Akron, Ohio. That was my debut and my final show as a singer. It was not very good. Harpo was not a good bass player. So we got back, and Harpo was like, "You're playing bass. I'm singing." And it worked out good because my brother played bass, my sister played bass, and I have my brother's original bass that I've been using for about 40 years now, using the same bass.
Wow. Was that New Jersey's finest?
That was New Jersey's finest, correct.
Wow, wow. So that was like right out of the gate, you're playing
I
in a
was I
band.
was in a band before I knew how to play an instrument.
So this would have been 80, 81, 82.
82, December 82 was my first gig.
Fantastic. So I know because I've had other guests from the era, they referenced that band. I know there's at least one demo on YouTube. So I know there was documentation. How active were you as a band as far as recording and doing shows and
It was very short lived. It was just really a wild time. We played everything from CDs, A7, open from Agnostic Front. One of the most brilliant gigs ever concocted was in Philly. It was MDC, DRI, and NJF. I thought that was a brilliant combo. But yeah, it was very short lived. Harpo had decided to join the Navy, so he had split the band, and we tried to keep it going on. We had enlisted Doug and all, but it just didn't work out, and that was the birth of Pleased Youth.
fantastic. So Uh, you mentioned Police Youth, and we're going to definitely do a deep dive into that. But I'm curious too because even way back, I think the earliest photo I've ever seen of you would have been that early lineup of Pleased Youth with Dave singing. Um, and I clearly remember the moment I saw Niblick Henbane's picture in the EC Rocker, which probably would have been the cover of What's Your Deal, or the band photo from that record. Um, you early on, you took on the skinhead aesthetic
Oh yeah,
and
one of
lifestyle.
the original 82. It's just like in England they always talk about the spirit of 69. It really came to America in 82, and I'm not talking like hardcore, shave your head like Minor Threat or something like that. It was a real skinhead scene there in
Right.
82.
And I got kind of knowledgeable of that years later, with some of the bands I was with. Never considered myself one, officially part of that scene, but I was peripheral to a lot of it.
Right.
And I know, I know a bit about the English side of it and its history. When early 80s roll around, you're playing, you've got the thing going. There's obviously bands like early Agnostic Front definitely had that vibe in New York. Um, what stands out for you when you think about the early days and maybe those earlier connections through the skinhead scene at that time?
It seems like it's like very set in its ways now. You have to dress a certain way and all, and it was just new. Nobody had been a skinhead before in the United States, so you had whereas like in England you had more the ska and reggae, and and then oi came about from that. It was something new. So like bands like Agnostic Front, Iron Cross from DC, those, I think Agnostic Front, they had the most iconic, T-shirt, with the boots and all, that like sort of, just fit that era perfectly.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next step would be Please Youth. And I've had several members of the band on at this point, most recently Keith Hartel. Hello, Keith. Doug, Dave, Dave has been on. And I really love that band. One thing I've done a lot of doing this series is kind of looking, going back and replaying those records and kind of revisiting things and learning more about the time before I got into the Jersey scene. And I mean, Pleased Youth, AOD, Sacred Denial, they're kind of the Mount Rushmore for me when I think of like mid 80s, New Jersey punk slash hardcore. Um, so the early version of Pleased Youth was with Dave Scott singing.
Correct.
Yeah. And I know when I had Dave on the show, he talked about, kind of how do we put this? Being unceremoniously exited out of
Yes.
the band. Is it true you guys threw a cake down on his car?
It is, yeah, and that wasn't my idea. I could blame it on Paul because he's no longer with us. But he was a good. He was a. I mean, I was an instigator myself, but he just instigated the whole thing. I love Dave. Dave is a great guy, very talented, and we were even in a second band together at one point. But he was in AOD. AOD was taking precedent over Please Youth. I was only in Please Youth. So was Paul, and we just wanted someone dedicated to that band. And it's interesting because nothing against Keith or anything like that. Very talented, and what we did with Keith in the band was great. I just always think of like the early days with Dave. I just loved that sound we had. It was more of a hardcore sound.
Yeah, yeah. And that's come up in conversations with the other guys I've spoken to. In that I know just in the last few years, the demos came out with Pleased Youth, the
Yes.
more hardcore sounding stuff. And then by the time the album came out, you know, it sounded very there was kind of a wave of bands at that time kind of changing their sound a little bit. The most extreme example probably being Cause for Alarm by AF, which was like
Okay.
a real crossover. You guys didn't go that route, but it was definitely different. It was more, maybe college radio sounding, Husker Du-ish, maybe.
Fair assessment.
Yeah, yeah. So you guys went through a lot of different things in a short period of time. When Please Youth got up and running, um, who were some of the other contemporaries in the Jersey area that you were playing a lot of shows with, or just getting to know as things were?
Oh, Bedlam, Cyanamid. Yeah, God, I'm going to probably forget some people. Children in adult jails. There was a lot of the Buyer Records crowd there. Stets was somebody we played with a few times.
Yeah, yeah, Stets, that's a name that's got to be thrown into the mix and kept there because the Songs of Experience record is definitely on the list as well of I think sort of groundbreaking and trend-setting,
Yes,
Jersey albums of that time, and a band that doesn't get as much credit as they deserve. And of course, rest in peace, Wayne Russo, the drummer
yes,
from Stets. Um, so you're playing out with Pleased Youth. Doug had relayed a couple of stories about playing New York City with that band. Um, how deep into it did you get with New York City as far as making yourselves known out there?
Pleased Youth itself. We weren't very well known. I mean, I was friends with Agnostic Front, and also, Pleased Youth did open up for Agnostic Front at CBGB's at a matinee and all. But New York always had sort of a thing against New Jersey bands, it seemed. Not that we like hated them or anything like that, but New York was a much harder scene where New Jersey fun. It was like a fun scene, So
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot more Tommy Kaprowski than Roger Moret in
yeah,
Jersey.
exactly. And I did a lot of hanging out in New York at that time. It was a lot closer for me to get to New York than New Brunswick or,
Mm.
South Jersey. And also spent a lot of time at CB's, A7, 2+2, all the great Gildersleeves.
And this was certainly at a time well before mine, but from what I can gather. This wasn't a casual jaunt to go play a show. I mean, you're kind of driving into fucking hell to play
Yeah.
some of these gigs. I mean, New York early 80s is not the New York it is now. I mean, there's no question.
Oh,
Uh,
no.
How did you get into any kind of sketchy moments working, playing in those days?
Being in New York, yes, I had my moments where there was dangerous situations. Nothing where it ever amounted to anything. But like when you went down to New York, especially like A7 and all, you could go down to A7 and Avenue A, but you didn't want to go to B and C. Now you just see drunk college kids all over the place down there.
Yeah, yeah, and freestanding ATMs.
Yeah, it's really New York's really because I mean it's become kind of not that like having shitty neighborhoods and dangerous places to walk. It just sort of lost its whole vibe and feel. It's just kind of boring now.
Yeah, it was an adventure to do it then. Like when I was in my teens playing CBs initially, it was that was part of it. It wasn't even so much the show, it was actually just kind of getting to the show and hopefully getting through the night with your
Yeah,
car and your life. Definitely different times. So I want to get into some of the personalities in Pleased Youth because I've had enough of you guys on now to kind of get an idea of certain things. But I want to first talk about the guy who I can't get on the show unless I get a Ouija board somewhere, Paul Decolator. I had a brief encounter with him a couple, maybe a year or two before he passed away. But hearing the tales and knowing the legends, I think it's fairly safe to say he could be a handful at times. Is that?
he could be a handful. And one thing I must say about Paul, when I started playing bass in NJF, he taught me how to play bass. I mean, it
Mhm.
was literally put your finger there, put your finger now, strum up, strum down, put your finger there, and that was my early bass lessons. But yeah, Paul just. I swear he knew like everybody in the country, and like three-quarters of the people were pissed off at him. He just, like it was impossible for us to play City Gardens because he had a thing going with Randy now. Why I don't even know. Um, but he was always he was a very early zine tips and tours,
Mhm.
and he just managed to ruffle a lot of people's feathers with the things he wrote.
Yeah, yeah. I think I may have mentioned it on the video with Dave and maybe the one with Doug too. When I was writing for the Aquarian, he was the editor there for a minute. And the only time I ever spoke to him, my phone rang and he's like, "Where's that article?" And I'm like, "I sent it to you a week ago. I'll check again." Click. That was basically it. That was my Paul Decolator experience. Um, but obviously, somebody who played on some great records and then went on, later too to do some great stuff.
Yeah,
Uh,
lose the bristles. He did a few things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, so prior to the album being recorded, the Pleased Youth record, the Dangerous Choo Choo album, Dave goes back with AOD, and you get Keith Hartel, who was just most recently on this show from the band. Interesting character. I can
Oh,
only
very much
imagine what
so.
it would have been, when he was a teenager joining the band. How do you think bringing Keith on board changed things, musically and otherwise?
Well, I think there was more of a change with the music. Certainly, he brought a lot of talent to the band. Both vocals and then playing, singing and playing bass at the same time. He really did both of them really well. He got a good personality. I wouldn't say we were like best friends at that time. He was a lot younger than me, and I was just like, but a very talented guy, and it was good playing with him.
Very cool, very cool. And there comes a point where you leave the band. The band goes on for a bit. Like you said, Keith was playing bass and singing towards the end. What led to your decision to go somewhere
There
else?
was a lot going on traveling. I was working for a large company at that time, so working a lot of hours. So and I was up in Mawa, so I'd have to get from Mawa down to New Brunswick, and I really did not want to go on tour with them either. I just knew what was going to happen when they did go on tour. Not that I like touring at all, really, but so yeah, there was just there was a lot going on, and I couldn't find the time. I was going to seeing a lot of shows. At that point in my life, I would rather go see a band than go practice in New Brunswick.
Right, right, yeah. Um, how far after Please Youth did Niblick Henbane start taking shape?
After Please Do. Well, actually, I was in another band, short lived, Hollow Bodies. They were out from like Denville area, and we did. I think we did like maybe two or three shows together. One of them being Dag Nasty at Rutgers.
Mhm.
Um, and it was a good band, very talented band. Stacy, the drummer, she went. I think she may have been in mental abuse, but she went on to play with the Undead for a little bit. I know,
Oh,
so
Stacey Morris?
that might be
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So that was kind of short lived. And Niblick came around. Niblick started with our lineup with me, Harpo, and Larry around '86.
Mhm.
Harpo had started Niblick Henbane. He had asked me to be in the band, played a demo, and I said no. They were, they kind of really were not that good. And I had met Larry at a Sand in the Face show at Uppsala College, and Larry approached me, came up to me, said, "Hey, I see you everywhere. My name's Larry." We started talking. He's like, "I play guitar." I'm like, "I play bass." So we started getting together in my apartment, writing some songs. Early ones would be like "Crime with a Gun." Like, so, those were some early ones I remember writing. And Harpo had said, "Here, I want you to hear this demo tape again." This was maybe 6 months later. I was like, "Oh wow, that sounds pretty good." Yeah, I'd be interested in playing bass, but I'm playing with this other guy, Larry, who plays guitar. Would you be interested in having him come in? So me and Larry went and joined Niblick. At the time, it was Harpo and Mike, the long-haired devil worshipping Mike. And the music was really a lot different in the beginning. It was a drunk rock band, was the only way to describe it. We got in a lot of trouble. We get drunk, get into fights, typical thing. So that was the beginning.
Well, I was thinking right before we connected about Niblick sound, and you know, fast forward a little bit briefly to like 90, 91. That's when a lot of New Jersey oi bands came up.
Yes,
Broken Heroes, Head Wound was around at that time. I think Those Unknown were definitely playing at that
yes,
time as well. But Niblick was like a good 5 years before. I mean, you can say The Burnt, but The Burnt didn't have it fully there until the Retro ones formed, in my opinion.
correct. And all our early gigs were with the Burnt. We did a lot of gigs with the Burnt. Between like '86, maybe '89, I think. I
Yeah.
forget when they actually, broke up or whatever and became the Wretched Ones.
So you guys were really sort of steering into that more oi direction kind of years before a lot of the bands that we consider New Jersey oi, the standard bearers kind of arrived. I mean, were there any contemporaries, maybe besides the Burnt in those days, that kind of had a similar thing happening in Jersey?
No, not you know who U.S. Chaos. They always had that like that more that English skunk oi sound. One of my favorite bands too. They've been doing it for well over 40 years now.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw them, well, not just, but maybe in the last couple of years. They come back around every couple of years. It's always cool when they do because
Yeah,
they're one of those bands that just, when I think of Jersey, that's a bunch of guys that need to get on this channel as well. Um, so Niblik is kind of moving forward, and I gotta ask you this too. What is it with Niblick Headband and drummers? It was like the Final Tap of New Jersey Oi.
nothing personal, but drummers suck, and just we were just saddled with a bunch of dick bags. Chad. I'd wanted Chad in the band so early on. I'd asked him, especially when he left the Blanks for a while, and he was just like, "I'm not into doing it at the time." But we just got screwed over. They were Tommy. The ending of Tommy, we were supposed to play with Agnostic Front at a CD's matinee. And 3 days before the gig, Tommy's like, "Oh, I can't go. I rented a hotel room down the shore." And I'm like, "What the fuck is wrong with you, Tommy?" And I'm like, "I don't know if you're an asshole or an idiot." And I'm like, "You know what? You're both." Hung up the phone, called up Larry. I said, "You do whatever you want to do. I don't want Tommy in the band. I won't be in the band if Tommy is." So that was the end of Tommy. Great drummer, though. Really good drummer. But, he personality wise, musical taste really did not fit.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's, in any band, probably more important than the actual music. You kind of have to like the people you're going to be stuck in a van with for.
Yeah, it looks like a marriage. I mean, you have to get along. If you don't get along, I guess the Ramones pulled it off, but doesn't make it easy.
And I know, leading into like early 90s, the years go on. There were some shifts in the lineup. I know Harpo left for a little while. You guys got Brian from Sticks and Stones for he did a 7 inch with you guys. You left as well for a bit, right? You ended up playing in Scrooge.
I played in Scrooge. Yeah, not did I play with Those Unknown? No, Those Unknown came a little after that. But yeah, I was out of Niblick for I don't know, maybe 6 months, maybe might even been a year. And Armin from The Wretched came and played bass. And actually, the first band to record going down the bar was Niblick Henbane. We
Really?
we recorded the song first with Armin on bass.
Oh,
And
wow.
then Harpo really wanted to get me back in the band. So eventually Armin left, and I came back.
And Scrooge, that was with Dave Scott and a couple of the Genocide guys, right?
Pete Powers from Genocide, Dave from AOD, and who was Steve. Steven, I can't remember the other guy's name. I don't know if they came from another band or not, but I'd known Pete and Dave for many years at that point.
Yeah. And a very different band than what you had been playing in at that point.
Yes, yes.
This was kind of because I've heard some of the recordings. There's stuff online, because the band later became Grime Lord, which is kind of like the same general bunch of guys, but kind of hard rock, kind of Circus of Power-ish.
Yeah, that's a good description of it. Yeah, totally different than what I was used to. I wasn't playing with a band. David asked me, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. I'm not really good at playing music like that. I'm an oi bass player
Mm.
and punk. Playing more like in that sort of vein, there's a little bit more expected of the bass player, and so I it was a great time playing with him. I think we only probably did about 2 or 3 gigs with me in the band, but it was a fun time.
So I would imagine that band's playing different spots than the Niblick Band, or was it generally the
Oh
same?
yeah, it was just like it was more of like rock type shows.
Yeah.
We played once at the Pipeline actually, so actually it was pre me working at the Pipeline.
Cool. Well, let's use that as a segue because as you know, I did a whole series with Emilio last year about the pipeline, and a lot of people who are on this channel, yourself included, are people I met there. And I started going there in '93 when I was 16. So I'm kind of a
I didn't know you
later,
were that young. Wow.
but obviously it was a great place. I have a lot of very fond memories. I met tremendous people there who I still know to this day. Um, there wasn't any place like it ever. I mean, I've played in
Wow.
London, Canada, California, Chicago. No place was like the Pipeline. And I'm just so happy. I had so many times to play there and just go to shows there. Um, how were you first introduced to it? Were you there in like the DJ Freaks days, or was it officially the Pipeline?
No, I did not. I came there as the Pipeline. I think I showed up. I think Sham 69 was supposed to be playing. That was my first time. They never showed up. And I walked up to the door. Billy Weedo from Mental Decay was working, Bob Cody. And so they were like, they let me in for free. And, I immediately met Emilio and just, sort of hit it off with him. And I ended up working almost immediately. They were working the door and all.
Excellent. So that would have been like late 80s, certainly,
Yeah,
right?
like 88, I think it was 88,
And I think
maybe 89.
I
Not
think
quite.
Emilio had mentioned Niblick Henbane actually rehearsed there too.
Oh yeah, we used to practice there on off nights, and it was fun. I used to live in the basement. Not a high point of my life, but we had built a room down there. It had a bed. It was somewhat clean and all. But yeah, Niblick used to practice, and we used to practice like on Tuesday nights because that was an off night. And Iggy from Two Tone
Hmm.
used to hold his Barmy Army meetings there. and they would come in and they'd watch us practice before. Before they had their meetings and we headed out and stuff. So, we got to introduce ourselves to that up and coming crowd there.
Mm. I remember that basement well, actually.
Kind of
Um,
scary.
I remember it well because of two individuals I would meet up and we would meet in the basement and we would do things that I don't want to share. That gives a really weird impression. We were imbibing. Okay, we'll
Yes.
make it that way. But it was myself, Danny Brewer, rest in
Oh, Danny
peace,
Brewer. Wow.
and Jim Dunleavy from Bedlam and Hearst.
I met a lot of people there. I'll tell you, there's so many people. I met my wife Kathy. Me and Kathy met at the pipeline, and
Wow.
we got married, and we've been together 35 years.
That's amazing. It was that kind of place, man. When I had Larry on, we got into it. I think I got into it a bit with Emilio. Yeah, there were fights and there were, those scenes happening, but 99% of the time, it wasn't like that. It was just a congregation of people you can depend on seeing Thursday night. You'd walk through the door, there's our Norm, BT at the bar. It was always the same cast of characters, and it was all bands, so like you
Yes,
you see your friend's band play, and then like your next bunch of friends would come on and do their set. And a lot of us were on Headache Records at the time too. It
yes,
really was a unique scene in that respect. Also it was people who generally kind of had their shit together. I made that point with Larry. Like a lot of the Headache bands were working class guys who had
yeah,
careers. They weren't gutter punks. Um, and I think that kind of set things apart a little bit too. That particular part of that scene, a little older, a little
yeah.
more, like to have fun, but a little more serious at the same time. It was like they had a life to live.
It was a steady place. That's what really helped out the scene at that time. You knew every Thursday
Yeah.
there was a show at the pipeline, and bands that were playing CBs or Philly on the weekend, they were stopping in Newark. And there'd be the occasional matinee also on the weekends and all. But so many great bands came through there. Just like Nine Inch Nails played there, which is probably not one of my favorite bands, but it's one of the best bands I've ever seen there.
Yeah.
It was you could not move. It was that packed.
Yeah, yeah, and it's crazy. Just the connections Emilio still has with people. We got into it a bit when we did our thing. I mean, he's still so connected with everybody, people all over the
Yes.
country. Like you mentioned the pipeline in Chicago, and people will stand up at attention. Because Emilio helped our thing, but he was also heavy into the industrial scene. He helped out a lot of those Wax Trax bands when they were coming through town. And to
Yep.
this day, they still remember Emilio from 35 years ago, the time he like, put him up or bought him dinner or whatever. And that's what scenes need. And he and the pipeline were definitely the engine for a lot of that. So, $1 million question. When you mentioned Nine Inch Nails, what other shows from the pipeline still stay clear in your mind as great memories?
Playing with some of my heroes, the business. Actually, I think Broken Heroes was on tour with them before I was in the band, but it was Niblick, Broken Heroes, and the business. And the guys from the business were just the nicest bunch of guys wanting to talk to us. We were sitting at the bar after the show and just sitting around talking. It was just a really good experience. But seeing like the Anti Nowhere League there,
Hmm.
one of our surprise bands, it was a Thursday night. Nobody was there. And we went to go see the Swinging Utters. And it was like empty. Nobody knew who they were. And they played so great. They played like the place was packed. It was just such an awesome show. There was just so many bands that came through. I can't even think of them all now.
Yeah, yeah. I struggle with that too because I was drunk most of the time, but
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
And like even like the Addicts played there. I'm trying to remember everybody who played there. It was just DOA. One another really classic gig. DOA and AOD. Brilliant coming up with that.
yeah, yeah, totally. I remember, Boots and Braces from Germany came and played. Um,
Yes.
that was a big fight night, unfortunately, but the
I don't
band,
know if that was the one. Oh, that was the one where Yeah, I had a gun pulled on me and my head split open with a bottle. But
Oh shit, it was that night?
I believe it was that. I believe it was that night. It was an English band or a German band. I can't remember which one it was.
Yeah, because I remember that was the night where like the entire place just spilled out in the street. And I
Yes,
remember
it sounds like it. Yeah,
like I'm like looking back towards the door from the front of the stage, and I'm seeing like this wave of people just like heading towards the door, and then there's one face looking the other way, Anthony Trance, yelling to somebody, "Call the police! Call the police!" Meanwhile, they're
it
like,
sounds like that day.
it's like a wave, and like Anthony's like in this wave being pushed out the door, you know? And yeah, I remember the guy from Boots and Braces broke his glasses, the singer. And I remember feeling bad for him as I'm like, I don't know how many more dates he's got on this tour. He's in, a different country and he fucking breaks his glasses, you know. It's like the little things you feel sorry for people when they're on tour and shit like that
Yeah.
happen, you know.
Mentioning Anthony, he was just such a big thing there, And after Anthony was gone, the shows really it wasn't as good. Anthony had done a great job with booking bands and all.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I like I said, I played my first show there in '93. Um, and it was kind of hodgepodgey. Would you like the pipeline always felt kind of hodgepodgey to me as far as the bands they would have. They have like really eclectic shows like Typo Negative and Prong on the same bill, which kind
Yeah.
of makes sense, but they'd have, you know what I mean? There wasn't a coherent direction, I think, until Trance came on board.
Yep.
Because you knew those shows you either have like a hardcore bill or an oi bill or a little bit of, a little more of like a pop punk bill, but it was a lot more coherent and cohesive, I think, when Trance took over. So you knew kind of what to expect. Not saying the earlier way was bad or anything. The earlier way was awesome because it was such a mixture of different things. But I think Anthony, those page size ads in the Aquarian, you pick the night you'd want to go to. Like, oh, this is Warzone and E-Town Concrete. Maybe I'll go to Niblick and Retro ones instead. Those sort of decisions you'd have to make. But he definitely elevated that place.
Oh, very much so. He brought in a lot of really good bands, really good lineups for shows and stuff. He brought the Dropkicks played. They opened for Niblick Henbane. I thought like that's my prized possession. Niblick Henbane, Dropkick Murphys underneath.
And what's crazy about that is, within 6 months, they were the biggest fucking band. Like they went from playing the Pipeline to signing the Hellcat.
They did burst on the scene. I remember when they were on the Warp Tour, they started playing on the small stage. They had to move them to the big stage,
Yeah.
and we played some great shows with them after largest shows I've ever played. Trocadero and Philly, Art Stocks down South Jersey, a whole bunch of really big gigs we played with them.
Yeah. I know I definitely played a show with them in New London, Connecticut when the Ois compilation was recorded, the third volume,
Okay,
when Radical Records was putting out stuff. And they were like just starting to just starting to break. They had gone from that point where they were playing like the Thursday Pipeline shows, and they were kind of like the marquee band that weekend. And then they became just, you know, crazy, and they're still playing. They're still making
they
headlines.
are
And I know they
really
got
really
this whole,
talented bunch of people and really good guys. I mean, really good, honest, people.
yeah. I know Ken. Ken's getting a lot of attention these days for some of his political statements. But whenever I talked to him, he was always very business, very focused, had a plan, and knew how to implement his ideas. It's no surprise to me
Yes.
that band went as far as it has.
Yeah, I always expected him to become the mayor of Boston at some point.
Yeah, I remember talking to him back in 2000. They had come out with "Sing Loud, Sing Proud," and they had changed the band around a little bit. They got a couple younger guys in the band, and I asked him, what? Like, it looks kind of like a different band now. He said, "Well, that's kind of the point because our audience is getting younger, and we got to have some fresh blood in the band, to build more of a connection with the audience." And I'm like, "Well, it's actually a different perspective." And he was clearly onto something, because they were playing to those younger crowds at that point. Um,
One last story about them. It was just I forget where they were playing, and I forget like the door price was maybe $10, and there was a line around the block, so the promoter raised the price at the door to 15. And I saw Ken. Ken went ballistic. He was screaming. He grabbed the guy's like, "Don't worry, we'll pay you more money." So he grabbed a wad of cash, like $1,000, handed it to my wife Kathy, and he said, when I asked for it, hand it to me on stage." Took a wad of cash and just threw it out to the audience. It was just a really cool punk rock thing to do.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And they've maintained that philosophy, I feel. I can't say I'm super into some of the more recent stuff musically, but goddamn, man, more power to them. About a year and a half ago, I live in New Hampshire these days, and I was working down in Concord, the state capital. We have a big theater in town, and massive marquee just had Dropkick Murphys on the marquee one night. And I'm like, God damn, man, It's like those guys were schlubbing it out with the rest of us at the pipeline, and here they are doing that and, even bigger
Good for
shows.
them.
More power to them. So, there comes a point where, Niblick kind of grinds to a halt for a while. I know Larry relocated and stuff like that. Um, it was kind of around that time that Pleased Youth kind of re-enters the picture for a bit because you guys had that reunion show with Paul
Yes.
before he passed away.
Yeah, it was great. I we played two shows at the Court Tavern. One was a matinee, one was a night show with Adrenaline OD, and it was great because Dave sang songs and Keith sang songs. So and the crowd. There's some videos of it, and the crowd is just going nuts. I had so much fun, and then I was like, wow, we're gonna maybe do this some more. We're gonna do this. And then, I don't know, weeks later, I got a call and I see it's Paul from the caller ID. I'm like, I don't feel like dealing with Paul right now. And so I didn't pick it up. The phone rang again. I'm like, all right, I'll just pick it up. And it was his girlfriend at the time. And, she told me what had happened and, just sucked. What a stupid way to die. Him, Anthony Trans. I've had so many people in my life that are not around because of shit like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, it still goes on like that.
Yes. No
Yeah.
one no one is in my life anymore who does, who's doing dope and stuff like that. They're not going to be part of my life ever again.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, because there are some wonderful people who went down that
Yep.
route, and you wish for whatever reason they would have made a different decision somehow, some way. But
Yeah, what they could have possibly done. They died so young. Paul was a very good writer. But not just music, but just writing articles and stuff
yeah.
like that. I forget how old he was. He could have been mid 30s at the time. So you know,
Yeah, very sad. Very sad. Do you still keep in touch with the rest of the Pleased Youth guys?
Yeah, it's somewhat when I see them. Doug and Keith and all. I hadn't seen them in many years, and then Doug was working at the Court Tavern, so I would start seeing Doug all the time, and we sort of rekindled a friendship. We got offered some great gigs there. He must have said something because all the bartenders were always giving me free drinks. So, but yeah, I mean, I like them both. We run in different circles.
Yeah.
So, we did, right before the pandemic, we had done a couple of shows also, again, without Paul.
Yeah, it's interesting with you guys in particular because the individual members have done interesting things, and very different things from each other.
Yes.
Doug's most recent record, the Slugger stuff, is phenomenal, but very different than Pleased Youth, right? And of course, Bad Karma was way different. Keith has had this whole thing. I mean, the guy played with Richard Lloyd for a bit.
Yeah. It's amazing. But
Yeah,
the stuff Keith has done, it's just amazing.
yeah. So, definitely a talented bunch of people, and I'm happy to chronicle some of it, doing what I do here. Um, of course, inevitably, we got to get into the fact that you play bass in Broken Heroes, one of my former bands.
Yes.
Welcome to the support group I've started to. And I think you've been with Broken Heroes now longer than any other band you've been a part of, right?
Well, Niblick was, at being totally active. Yeah, I would say Broken Heroes. It's 14 years now. I was always like Andy from Niblick. I'm Andy from Broken Heroes now. And the time spent. I mean, we've had a couple of lineup changes since I've been in the band. You should think about Broken Heroes. They've had lineup changes, but we've put out good records.
Yeah.
I think some of the best stuff that Broken Heroes put out was over the last 14 years. I came into the band as a fan. So, this was a band I like. I loved Broken Heroes when they were raw, when they were a little bit sloppy, and and they just sounded like an oi band. And we are an oi band. We're not a street punk band. We're not pussyfooting around. Oh, we're not an oi band. We are an oi band.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one thing I've always loved about Broken Heroes is, yeah, they've had a lot of people in that band. I think when I had Tim on, we kind of went through some of it, and it's like a lot of people. But to the very best of my knowledge, I mean, there may be one or two I'm not aware of. I don't think anybody has ever been an ex-member of Broken Heroes where somebody's been like, yeah, fuck that guy.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. Well, you saw like with the benefit we did last April. Fancy was up on stage singing. You came up on stage, talk about stuff. It's and like last we played up in I can't even think of where we played about a month or so ago. One of the old bass players showed up, Seidel, I forget.
Yeah, yeah, Scott. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Scott Seidel showed up. So, it's always been like a family sort of thing. I personally don't know of any broken heroes that are like have been excommunicated and, or hated.
No, no, they've never been those kind of people, and that's why I did two stints in that band. One for a few months back in the '90s, and I came back for 2 years, about maybe a decade or so later, maybe shorter than that. But yeah, I was with them for a couple times, and there were different faces in both of those scenarios. But Pete was always the constant. Um, and
Yes.
Tim's been there obviously from the beginning. He's had his breaks, but the funny thing is, as I said to those guys when they were on, I'm going to end up in the band again someday. It's just the way it is. Like,
You know, look at Quincy. Quincy
yeah,
has managed to play bass, guitar, and drums in the band.
yeah, yeah. And the best thing for me about being in Broken Heroes was always it wasn't even so much about the music. Like I said earlier, about being in a van with somebody. We'd go play Detroit. And Tim would have his laptop. We were watching like Eddie Murphy Raw, and all these different movies, and just having a blast. It was like the Weekend Warrior thing. And so many great memories with those guys. And they're friends. They're not just band members. Like, they're friends, they're family. They treat people around them very well. Always
Yeah.
have. And like I said, the only band I've ever been in that everything's always cool. Like there's never any issues with anybody. You can leave the band. I left the band to get married and move up here. Probably should have just stayed in fucking Jersey, to be honest with you. Um,
New Hampshire's pretty cool, though.
it's got its moments. I do like certain things about it, but you know, I a lot of my life is still elsewhere. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like there aren't a lot of big Pete-sized parties up in New Hampshire, man. If I want to hang out, I got to drive down there. It's kind of
Yeah.
it is. But always a fun band. I know you guys have been, putting out a lot of music and working on things. Where are things currently with the band as far as new material and plans for the
We have material that we will be recording. We do need to write some more stuff. We did the switch over. Scotty left the band. He moved out to San Francisco to work for the VA out that way. And Tim came into the band at that point. Not came into the band, but switched from playing lead guitar to singing. And
Yeah.
Aaron joined. And Aaron is a really freaking good guitar player. I mean, like me and Peter, oi, we play oi. We're like the sort of the fist and the boot, to the music, and Aaron just can play these leads, and he's amazing.
Yeah, like I said earlier before we started recording, this lineup, this Broken Heroes lineup, is as strong, if not stronger, than the original Jump for Oi version of the band, which I thought
Wow.
was such a great template, for that time. I remember going to see Broken Heroes in '93 with my buddy Dave playing at the Rusty Nail. Remember that place in Parsippany, the Rusty Nail?
Oh wow, I don't think I ever went there. I remember the name though.
Yeah, that like the Bristles played there. My first
Okay.
band played there. It was that era. Flatus played a ton of times there. And it was the Broken Heroes lineup with Kevin, singing the whole thing. And I'm like, these guys are fucking intimidating, you know what I mean? Like you see the covers, like, oh, these are tough guys. And you talk to them, you're like, hey man, how you doing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Like you
yeah.
ain't tough.
I just really enjoy. We have a great time when we're playing. We have a lot of stupid inside jokes. Before joining the band, I was just starting to get friendly with Pete. Pete is a friend now. Lindsay is a friend. Tim I've known for a long time. Steve is an amazing drummer. He's like clockwork.
Yeah.
We played in Atlanta back September. He had been out of the band for a year. He had one practice with us. We went to Atlanta, and it was like the best gig we ever played.
Is he playing with you guys now or is it Quincy?
Quincy left.
Okay.
Quincy had things going on, but we brought Steve back in.
Quincy will be back. I'll be back. We're all going to be back. You
Yeah.
have to leave the band at least once, Andy, so you can come back. Because coming back is always great. It's like reunited with family. And I'll tell you with Pete, not to get too sobby about the guy or sappy about the guy, but the truth is, you would be hard pressed to find a more loyal, straight up, dedicated friend in person in your life than Pete.
Agreed.
Just
Agreed. And he
solid.
has this scary looking persona about him. He always says this about me. He goes, "We were scared of you when you worked at the pipeline." I'm like, really? That you always look like you were pissed off. And whenever I saw Pete, I'm like, oh, he looks like he's ready to kick somebody's ass. But yeah, you're right. He's a nice guy.
Yeah, good guys, good people, a lot of great memories of those guys. And we have similar variations of the same stories, just the goofiness, the fun,
Yeah,
and kicking fucking ass. I mean, when I was in the band, they really worked to have a fun show, a strong show. When Fincy was in the band, because he's such a character, it was a little bit more kind of tongue in cheek, I think, than it is now, maybe. But I know that Broken Heroes humor is always going to bubble up in some way because
yeah,
it's inevitable.
yes,
Cool. Well, I'm glad you found your home with those guys, man. It's cool that you've had such a long run with them. You know,
yeah. It was perfect timing. When Pete asked me if I was interested, and I said yes.
very cool, very cool. Kind of wrap up with a couple of historical questions. And you've been in this for so long, and you've seen a lot of different scenes, played a lot of different towns in Jersey. When I had a couple recent guests on, I made the point that New Jersey isn't just one big scene. There's all kinds of pockets of things going on. And
Yeah.
you were down doing the New Brunswick thing with the Pleased Youth and the Newark scene. A lot of characters come through. Who are some bands that in 2025 really deserve more of a look than they may have gotten the first time around from our history in Jersey?
I mentioned U.S. Chaos before. Always one of my favorite. Blank 77. I was really surprised. I mean, they have done really well for themselves, but I think they should have. I think they should have a larger audience than they do. And then there's those unknown. I mean, I just Bill's lyrics. They just hit home. He has so many songs where those lyrics just grab you, and that voice of his. It was that I'd say those unknown is one of the bands like that. That was so short lived, and they were very chaotic themselves. So, you know,
Yeah, I think you're right. Even when Bill went out to California and did a version of the band out there, That record they did on TKO. Um,
It was I did not like. I like the EPs better,
yeah. I
sound quality and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, they did I think it was an EP, like maybe in the year 2000. I can't recall the name of it, but it was cool. It was kind of like Bill really kind of got the Billy Bragg thing going, like it was a really solid record. I don't know if he's doing anything with it now. I mean, this goes back a long time,
I
but
don't think he is. They actually they came out and played with Broken Heroes and Niblick in 2012. We did a pipeline reunion at the Stanhope House.
right,
They
right.
all they had all stayed. Broken Heroes, the California version, had stayed with me here in Jersey, and I think they played. I think they played New Jersey and Brooklyn. That was it.
Excellent. Excellent. I mean, yeah, I missed that reunion. I knew it was going on. I wish I could have gone down for that. But it's really something too. I mean, I look at YouTube and all those old headache records, man, are up there, and people are getting
Oh
into it,
yeah,
more, all over the world. I mean, young kids that weren't even born when I was going to the pipeline. Um, like my old band Squiggy gets a lot of views on YouTube, and it's kind of amazing this thing that was kind of centralized to Jersey for a bit has grown and expanded to where there's a great legacy with these bands, especially now that, people are getting to a certain point in life. We just lost BT last year for the
yeah,
Wretched
that's
Ones. It's good to see this era is taking on, a new life in the present tense, and talking to Emilio, and he's telling me all these things about plans for like the future pipeline, using more of like a tech space to get things moving, and um, people are referring back to those days. So it's cool. It's cool that something we were doing for fun on Thursday night has
yeah.
taken on a life of its own. How about characters? We talked about bands, but I know Jersey's full of characters, man. Who were some of the people who really, just by their mere presence, sort of defined the scenes that you were a part of?
No, there's quite a few of them. Eli, Uncle Eli, the Pleased Youth song. He's somebody who was a real character back then. And there was, boy, I kind of can't think of names right now. People who weren't in bands but were just always there. Tommy Blewett. He that very funny, very talented. What he does with plays and stuff. He's been around for a really long time,
Yeah.
and his sister Veronica too. They have been around. I've known them for like probably over 30 years now.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here. Same here. And Tommy was doing a clubhouse in Opacon. Uh,
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
yeah. And that was really kind of for us Sussex County Hicks. I mean, that was kind of like um, pre-pipeline for a lot of people. It was kind of the precursor to a lot of people doing hall shows, myself included. So yeah, Tommy's definitely been around. And of course, you got the pipeline characters, the Marty Munches, the
Oh
X's.
yeah, how can I forget Marty? Marty Munch is like a cartoon. He's just that's what he's. Marty is Marty. He sort of reminds me of Decolator in a lot of ways because he has that knack for pissing people off.
What I love about Marty is you can go 5 years without seeing him, or 10 years or whatever, 6 months, doesn't matter. He sees you, he starts talking like you're still in mid-conversation from the last time. Like, yeah, so anyway, but
Yeah, that's Marty.
yeah, interesting characters, man, and it's a great history, and it's been a lot of fun, connecting with people like you and the other guys in Pleased Youth, all the AOD guys who've been on, Kaprosky. The list is getting pretty long at this point of people from before my days in the scene coming on and talking and sharing the history. So I really thank you for taking some time to come on. And
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
yeah, I'm really glad we finally did this. And I'm sure we'll be, I was about to say, I'm sure I'll see you around, but I'm sure I'll be at Broken Heroes band rehearsal with you at some point
That
too.
would be awesome, dude. That would be awesome.
It's gonna happen. That's just the way it is. I don't know when it's gonna happen, but it will happen. So when it does, can't wait for it to take place.
Well,
Andy, man, thanks again.
yeah, take care, man.